I mean, Jerusalem has fallen, but it just seems very unlikely that this kind of motley crew of an army, whipped up from many different factions and places, fighting on unfamiliar terrain most of the time in an unfamiliar climate, and dealing with so many unknowns, would actually succeed in the end. And now you also said that they lose 75% of their forces as well.
Okay,
And yet
yeah.
they did succeed. It's like dropping an army on Mars and hoping they're going to achieve anything there. To what do you attribute the success of the First Crusade? You did mention morale before, but there must have been more, right?
Yeah, it really, really shouldn't have worked. It really shouldn't. And people have described Urban as launching the crusade, but in many ways, it was an enormous act of, from a purely military and practical perspective, it's hard to imagine the Pope ever believing this could ever work, because let's just acknowledge the challenge. They've got to march from Western Europe to Jerusalem. And we have reports of Crusaders getting halfway through Germany and saying, okay, we've been marching for weeks. Where's Jerusalem then? They have no idea where they're going.
Yeah.
There's no formal command structure. Large numbers of the Crusaders are non-combatants. They're just pilgrims going to Jerusalem. And so they've got to be fed and protected whilst offering nothing in return from a military perspective. They are going up against the Seljuk Turkish Empire, which is arguably the most effective and most elite empire, and with extraordinarily competent armies of its era. And they're doing it with no logistics, really, or very, very light logistics. And this is a time when nomadic armies were, of their very nature, more effective than agricultural armies like those raised by the Crusaders. So it really, really shouldn't have worked. The factors that caused it to work, in my view, are firstly that some of their leaders were very, very competent. People like Bohemond of Taranto, a southern Norman conqueror, very experienced. And so he managed to work out ways of conducting battles that could, to some extent, offset the disadvantages of his own armies. There are groups in the Middle East willing to work with the Crusaders and support them, and that also is important. The Byzantine Empire is the obvious example, but there are also several Eastern Christian groups, particularly many Armenian societies, who have suffered under the Seljuk Turks and are willing to provide some support for the Crusaders. There are also some Bedouin and Arab groups that also support the Crusaders. I suspect they probably were being driven off their grazing grounds by the Turks, who of course are nomadic, but that's a little bit of a guess. But there are Muslim allies for the First Crusade. And until the siege of Jerusalem, the Fatimid Empire, that's a Shia Muslim empire centered on Egypt, the Fatimids wanted to resist the Seljuk Turks, who controlled much of the Middle East. And they too, for much of the Crusades' course, were prepared to ally with the Crusaders. They do have allies. But even so, it still requires a fair amount of explanation. I think there's also ideological factors, religious commitment, the fact they've got no way of returning home, where it's be very difficult, so they can't escape easily. And then, of course, as they start winning battles, they become more experienced, better able to work together. Their troops become more competent, their skills improve, and once you've begun to win the first battle, you become better able to win the second battle. Once you've won the fifth battle, then you're going to be winning whatever happens, because you're just that effective in combat.
So they did learn pretty quickly.
They learn a lot, and they're very, very interested in the warcraft of their opponents. There's a real focus on that in the reports written by the Crusaders. They want to understand how the armies raised by the Seljuk Turks or by the Fatimid Empire in Egypt, how those armies operate. But obviously they're looking for weak spots. So, for example, they discover that the Seljuk Turkish armies, which are mostly made up of mounted archers, they work out the Seljuk Turks' bows, the bowstrings, they become weak and they begin to stretch in the rain. So if they get moisture, they stretch. And so the lesson from that for the Crusaders is fight in the rain.
What kind of a shock did the conquest of Jerusalem cause in the Muslim world?
It causes a substantial shock. Of course, before the Crusaders' arrival, Jerusalem had been besieged many times. Jerusalem had been on the frontier of war between the Seljuk Turkish Empire and the Fatimid Empire. And in, I think it was 1078, there was another very brutal massacre in Jerusalem conducted by the Turks. So Jerusalem is already a war zone, and the city itself has suffered a great deal. But the sudden and unexpected arrival of the Crusade, and particularly as this is a Christian invasion army, that is a major shock because, of course, Jerusalem thereafter is in Christian rather than Muslim hands. So that does seem to have caused a fair amount of shock, although it is difficult to gauge. We do have some reports close to when the actual siege of Jerusalem expressing shock, although many of the descriptions we have of the Crusader siege of Jerusalem come from many decades later. And so it's difficult to know exactly how people responded at the time.
Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe to the podcast on YouTube, follow on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. If you can, all these tedious marketing tutorials instruct that I have to say this, so I'm saying it. Also, if you'd like to, do support me on Patreon. This is a one-person podcast. I do everything by my little old self. There's no team behind me whatsoever. It's a tragic state of affairs, I know, but you can help. Please hop on Patreon and find smart cookies there. And then last but certainly not least, I have to thank my existing patrons, Tovaryshi and Tovaryshice. You are the champions of my heart. You are the heart of this podcast as well. Without you, there will be no smart cookies, which makes you producers of this show. So eternal thanks to Matija Zupančić, Dejan Žulnir, Darej, Rok Tržan, Saša Vipotnik, Neven Cvijanović, Juž Premrov, Nejcir, Goran Ivašić, Anže Sever, Ole, Marin Ferrara, Aljaž Mahar, Štrole, Ajda, Mancian, Miha Medved, Medinho, Goran, Gordon, Lorenzo, Jurečuk, Mila, Carmen, Veronica, and Taichi. Thanks again, you legends. The community is growing, which makes me super happy. So, yes, thanks again.